Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The French Art of Living Well, Finding Joie de Vivre in the Everyday World, by Cathy Yandell, narrated by Niemi. Un premier mot, a first word. Du vin, mademoiselle? The waiter inquired, moving the wine bottle toward my empty glass. He had come to our long table in steerage class with a bottle of wine in one hand and a white cloth draped over his forearm to absorb the inevitable spills as the ship careened back and forth. I had never had wine before. Raised by a non-drinking Protestant family, I was hesitant. It was decades ago, and I had come to New York from New Mexico to sail with a group of disheveled American students in the lowest possible class on one of the last crossings of the elegant ocean liner, the SS France. The stately and dapper director of the Study Abroad program, a Mr. Holmes, was an American who had lived in Paris for several years. At about 6'5", he was a towering figure in every sense. He seemed to know everything about France, and I tried to imagine what it would be like to inhabit his body and his mind. He had so much experience with French language and culture. Plus, at his height, the view must have been excellent from up there. While telling us students that we could certainly choose not to drink wine, he reminded us that wine was a point of considerable pride in France, and that by refusing to try it, we would be rejecting an important element of French culture. The same was true, he said, of various French cheeses. 365 of them, one for every day of the year. I liked cheese, but what to do about the wine? Dilemma. Why have I come on this trip with over 1,000 people, not one of whom have I ever met? I began to ask myself. As a child in New Mexico, I had heard Spanish, Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni spoken around me, and I loved learning expressions in other languages from my friends, but I had never heard French. When I was about 5 years old, my mother taught me an Americanized version of the song Frère Jacques, whose refrain, Sonnez les matines, ring the bells for matin, or morning prayer, became, in our pronunciation, Samalamatina. Later, a Belgian singer in an international choir stayed with my family, and when she asked if I knew Frère Jacques and suggested that we sing it in a round, I answered excitedly, "Yes, of course." But when she began to sing, my jaw dropped. Other than the melody, I recognized absolutely nothing about the original song. When she sang those same words, they were so different and so beautiful. I was mesmerized. Years later, on that huge ocean liner, I reminded myself that, yes, it was all terrifying, but yes, taking this leap was the only way to immerse myself in French. As I sat at the table with that wine bottle poised above my glass, an image popped into my head. Walking from our Spartan submarine-style rooms to the deck, I had noticed tables of smartly dressed people speaking French, drinking espresso, and laughing, deep in discussion, as though they had all the time in the world. Well, we did have a lot of time, but how could they converse contentedly for so long? The same thought crossed my mind during the apéritif, before dinner drinks, later in the day. For the French on the ship, the purpose of the voyage seemed to be the pleasure of the journey and of one another's company, while most of us Americans were ticking off the days till we landed. The French had an intriguing, relaxed insouciance about them, I thought. Something we might be missing. My dilemma quickly dissolved, and I looked up at the waiter holding the bottle of wine. "Oui, s'il vous plaît," I said. With that first glass of wine on the ship, little did I know that I was beginning what would turn out to be a continuing journey, enjoying wine, to be sure, but more broadly, drinking in French culture and opening up to a new world. There is a word for it, débarquer, to land, to disembark. It also means to realize, to become aware of something. When I first arrived in Paris, those meanings coalesced. After reaching Le Havre, taking a bumpy bus ride and disembarking again into the teeming capital city, I realized that no matter what happened during the year ahead of me, monumental changes were on the horizon. The elegant women and well-dressed men all seemed so detached as they bustled by me on the sidewalk. I gazed dizzily around. How old could these impressive buildings be? Like a stargazer who suddenly realizes she is only a speck of dust in the universe, I became all too aware of my modest stature on that Parisian sidewalk. Little wonder, as I now picture myself there, a skinny, acne-ridden teenager. To make matters worse, my short skirt, all the rage in the United States at that time, looked like a little scrap of ill-fitting material next to the longer, flowing dresses of the chic, young Parisian women. My skirt drew attention only to my toothpick legs and clunky American shoes. My long, straight blonde hair in no way looked French, and every time I tried to wear a scarf, it was as though I were either incapable of making a knot or trying to strangle myself. In short, nothing about me looked French. Clearly, I had a lot of work ahead of me. I didn't want to become French. I wanted to be French, and that was a stiff order. For the study abroad program, I had been assigned to live with the Hamels, an elderly French couple whose apartment looked onto the Champ de Mars, a field dedicated to the god of war, and the Eiffel Tower. It was magical for a small-town girl to open her bedroom shutters, another concept I had never encountered, every morning to see the sun beaming on that iconic tower and the trees below it. I would soon learn, however, that aside from the mobs of tourists passing through, the neighborhood was virtually dead, sleepy and residential. Fortunately, our classes were held in the Latin Quarter, where everything seemed more vibrant. The Hamels were a reserved and quiet couple. The only time my assigned roommate Diane and I ever talked with them was over dinner. We were off to classes during the day, but early in the morning, Madame Hamel would bring our breakfast into our room on trays. Biscotte, Melba toast, apricot jam, always apricot, and tea. Meanwhile, people all over Paris were simultaneously feasting on freshly baked baguettes and sipping café au lait, but I didn't know that at the time. Nor did I know that having calf's tongue for dinner, with its spongy, bumpy texture, was not a frequent occurrence in other Parisian households. Nonetheless, I was grateful to be staying with a kind French family, delighted to hear French spoken around me, and thrilled to be living in Paris. My parents had never left the North American continent, so I was all the more aware of my good fortune. Diane's father was the CEO of a famous, now defunct, toy empire. When he and his wife came to visit their daughter in Paris, they generously invited me to join all of them for dinner at Maxime's, the most famous and most exclusive restaurant in Paris at the time. Both Diane and her mother wore fur. As we handed our coats over to the clerk in the vestiaire, cloakroom, I noticed that mine, made of dull beige cloth with plastic buttons, was singularly the only coat in the room not made of fur. The PETA movement, which was just then taking shape in the United States, hadn't yet reached Paris. Following a meal of escargot, snails, bœuf bourguignon, and île flottante, floating island, a light meringue swimming in a sea of English cream, we went to the famous cabaret spot called the Lido de Paris to watch topless dancers strut around the stage in feathers. Having been brought up in a modest family, in terms of both means and morals, I suddenly found myself in another world. Puzzling, albeit intriguing. Despite my surprise, there was something about this culture I found enticing. But it wasn't the glitter, glitz and glamour that drew me in. It was the spirit of celebration. In the Amel's apartment, I had access to the only telephone, a landline. But that brought another challenge. Although live operators had disappeared from daily life back home, France was still filled with them, and if a connection couldn't be made, the operator came on the line to see if it was always a she, could be of assistance. Each time I had to make a call, before dialing, I would stare at the phone, building up confidence and reciting the number out loud in case I was asked for it. Any number above 80 in French is a bear. For 97, you say 97, 4, 20, 10, 7. So if you're not quick at addition, you're out of luck. Plus, I was worried about my accent. What if the operator knows I'm American? Of course the operator will know I'm American. Dream on. Happily, despite my panic, the few times the operator came on, I was able to spit out the numbers more or less on cue, and she obligingly made the connection. Little by little, I warmed up to those hermetic numbers, and the telephone ultimately held the key that would unlock the door to my new friends. The Amel's grown children and grandchildren occasionally visited the sunny apartment on the Avenue de la Bourdonnais, lending a palpable sense of conviviality to those family gatherings. The Amel's grandson Henri, a 4-year-old spark plug with brown, curly hair, helped me understand exactly why the French word for curly is bouclé, looped or buckled. Indeed, all over his head were small, round loops that shook when he jumped up and down, which was frequently. When I struck up a conversation with Henri, an immense wave of envy came over me. Here he was, 4 years old, speaking the most beautiful French in the world with no effort whatsoever, while I had been diligently studying French for those same 4 years, and mine was lamentable. How was that fair? The R's rolled off his tongue like honey, and his high-pitched sentences were the model of linguistic purity. As the year continued, I would eventually acquire enough French to have almost any conversation about anything, anywhere. Still, even after many more years of trying, my French would never have the perfect intonation of 4-year-old Henri's. How would I ever fit in? Patent leather ankle boots would probably do it, as 9 out of 10 students on the Boulevard Saint-Michel seemed to be wearing them. Finally, after a few months of buying virtually nothing, I gathered up my coins and my courage and walked into the Salamander shoe store in the Latin Quarter. Thanks to Salamander, pronounced at the time with the accent on the last syllable, pronounced der, I would be as French as I could possibly be. My new French friend Eve constantly raved about those shoes. And I would get them in the year's most popular color, a reddish cordovan color, which would go well with, virtually nothing I owned. But so what? I would look French. The biggest hurdle was this. I didn't know my shoe size in France. If I were actually French, how could I possibly not know my own shoe size by the age of 19? Inconceivable. Fortunately, I learned from someone that a 36 was a size S in clothing, and that shoe size often corresponded to clothing size in the metric system. So, with great fanfare, at least in my head, I waltzed into the store. When asked my pointure, I responded confidently, 36. It was working. I was making my first French purchase. I tried on the boots and walked briefly around the carpeted space. Elles sont jolies, non? They're nice, aren't they? The saleswoman remarked. Oui, très, I responded a tiny bit less confidently. My toes were touching the front ends of the boots, but surely that wouldn't be a problem. Patent leather stretches, doesn't it? In the blink of an eye, I was shelling out francs and zipping out the door to celebrate my victory, walking down the Boulevard Saint-Germain with my Salamander bag for all to see. At last, I was finally going to look French. The next morning, I slipped into the clothes that would be the least of all chromatic evils, le moins pire, the least worst, as the French jokingly say, and for the finishing touch, I donned the cordovan-colored boots. Down several flights of stairs and onto the street, down more stairs and into the subway, I was struck by a humbling realization. My toes were not simply touching the ends of the shoes. They were butting against them like the heads of opposing rugby teams when the whistle blows. But it was impossible to go back up to the apartment now. I would be late for class. My full-fledged Frenchness, I'm sorry to confess, lasted only one painful day. And, by the way, as I later learned, Salamander is a German company. I did, however, make one final effort to appear French and, by extension, to become cool. One day, I spotted a floppy brown felt hat on a street vendor's rack that might do the trick. It wasn't quite elegant enough to be a fedora, but it was trying desperately to come close, and in that sense it reminded me of myself. Not quite there, but almost. I would don the hat and stride through Paris, past the Sorbonne, into the Jardin du Luxembourg, and along the Seine. I would walk confidently, and I would be miraculously transformed. This, I thought, would be the beginning of a new life. Every American who has set foot in France has a story. Whether you have made only a brief stopover, done a quick tourist circuit, or lived in the country for many years. Hemingway had one, Gertrude Stein had one, and Emily, the character from the 2020s television series Emily in Paris, has one. Yes, French stereotypes are on display to some extent in all of them. But there is also a grain of truth in every cliché. Despite the American cultural baggage evident in all of these tales, we learn from them, laugh at the characters' gaffes, relive our own experiences, and compare our own interpretations of French culture to theirs. The book you are now listening to sets out merrily to celebrate and continue that tradition. But my story will not unfold over a self-revealing year in France or end happily ever after in a marriage to a Frenchman or Frenchwoman. Instead, with this book, I hope to sketch out my discovery and rediscovery over the course of a few decades of returning often to France of la joie de vivre, literally the joy of living. I lived in the country first as a student and later as a mother and a teacher of French literature and culture, sometimes in the context of directing a program for students abroad. While I run the risk, as the French literary critic Antoine Compagnon describes it, of exposing my own nullité, nudité, inanity, nakedness, I will take a few paths through culture, memory, history, and fiction to capture at least a bit of the uncapturable French art of living well. Joie de vivre. The term evokes baguettes, berets, bicycles, Bordeaux wines, perfumes and parasols, cheeses and checkered tablecloths, elegance and ease. In short, what is imagined to be Frenchness. While these snapshots are certainly part of the larger picture, they seem only to scratch the surface of a culturally rooted concept. The idea of joie de vivre must be fundamentally French, if English cannot manage to come up with its own term. Indeed, the word joie de vivre appears in Merriam-Webster's English Language Dictionary. What is it about French culture that generated the idea of joie de vivre? The first French-English dictionary, which dates to 1611, includes a few expressions involving joy. Joie de papillon, butterfly joy, defined in 17th century English as a momentary gladness, and fille de joie, daughter of joy, as a pleasant sinner. But there is no English equivalent for joie de vivre. The first use of the expression can be traced to later in that century, and then to Flaubert's novel L'Éducation sentimentale in the 19th century. But it didn't become a catchphrase until Émile Zola's ironically titled novel La Joie de Vivre was published serially in the 1880s. If you're looking for an uplifting read, this one may not be your best choice. Today, the term joie de vivre is too often associated with rarefied wine, sumptuous cuisine, and luxurious apparel, items reserved only for the white upper classes. But at all levels of class and society, the French seem to hold secrets to finding moments of joy in their daily lives. Why is this the case? And how can we, who are not French, grasp what constitutes this joie de vivre that defies definition? 1. Celebrating the senses. The first time I went to a French wedding, I had no idea what I was in for. The ceremony was held in a church, and the reception dinner in a large country house surrounded by gardens and farmland. "Oh, so this is your first French wedding?" a few bemused guests asked me. It started with a glass of champagne outdoors. What could be more glorious than champagne, friendly people, and an expanse of French countryside? Once we were seated inside, in a large open room with weathered beams, we were served an amuse-bouche, pre-appetizer, followed by an entrée, appetizer, followed by quenelle, fish dumplings with nantua sauce, a specialty of Lyon, the bride's home city, which I took to be the main course. Topics of conversation at my table ranged from guests' places of origin to travel destinations to the current political landscape. When things had settled down a bit, and I imagined we were waiting for the wedding cake, in came a huge tray of roasted duck, pommes sarladaises, potatoes cooked in duck fat, and fresh vegetables. By then, I was only picking at the cornucopia on my plate and slowing down on the delicious burgundy from a nearby vineyard. Was anyone noticing that I could scarcely eat another bite? How many more courses could there possibly be? Then came a lovely salad of crisp local greens, followed by cheeses from several regions. A blue cheese from Auvergne, sheep's cheese from the Pyrénées, and the ever-creamy Saint-Félicien from the Rhône-Alpes, all punctuated by discussion and good cheer. At last came the pièce montée en choux, a wedding tower of little pastries, and more champagne, followed by coffee, followed in turn by a digestif or pousse café, an after-dinner drink that pushes the coffee down. There is even such a thing as a pousse-pousse café, an after-dinner drink, though I don't believe we had one that evening. And for those who could still move, there was dancing throughout the night. Though not light on my feet that evening, I did dance. But I also learned for future reference that wedding dinners in France are to be approached gingerly. French culinary pride is always evident in the range and quantity of offerings, but the real point is to spend hours and hours engaging in conversation with people you know and people you don't know while enjoying an array of sensory delights. But this was only the tip of the iceberg in my discovery of the joy of sustained evenings. The earliest ending of any French wedding I have attended was 4 a.m., and no one over the age of 10 seemed sleepy. Time is subsumed by an abundance of pleasure. Weddings are only one example of the many French celebrations focused on food. Every time I returned from an evening with friends in Paris, my French host family would ask, "What did you have to eat?" That was always the first question, which puzzled me. Not where we went, not what we saw, not what we talked about, but what we ate. At first, I would respond with something like, "Oh, a quiche and some soup," and start to move on to another topic. but then they would want to know what kind of quiche and what kind of soup. At last, I had an epiphany. Celebrations and gastronomy are inseparable in France. Whereas in the United States, we often go to dinner and then to a show, in France, the dinner is the show. Marshall McLuhan famously declared that the medium is the message. In France, it occurred to me, the food is the message, or a big part of it. And the message is enjoy. Fast-forwarding several years, my husband and I, with daughters now in tow, went to my friend Josette's for Christmas dinner. At the time, our children were all in elementary school, and we were joined by a neighbor family including 3 children around the ages of ours. With presents in our arms for Josette's family, we arrived at the appointed hour of 1-ish to find family and neighbors all squeezed into the small apartment. There were 17 of us au total, counting grandmothers. The kitchen table, the dining table, and a folding table had all been pushed together and covered with festive tablecloths, and Josette's mother, Francine, was just bringing out her famous oeuf mimosa to put on the table. A bit like deviled eggs, but with hard-cooked egg yolk crumbled on top, making the dish look surprisingly like mimosa blossoms. Francine is from Perpignan, speaks with a strong southern accent, and has the biggest heart one can imagine. Chauvinistic regionals claim that everyone from Perpignan is open and welcoming. I haven't yet met enough residents of the city to confirm this stereotype, but it is certainly true of Francine. Jean-François, Josette's charming, jovial brother, who is rotund with a ruddy face and smiling eyes, opened the champagne without the usual loud pop like a pro. He belongs to a wine club, and other than the professionals, he knows more about wine than anyone I know, and he finds secret good deals and suppliers at every turn. He is happy to explain the terroir and soil quality necessary for the champagne or wine in question, the percentage of each type of grape involved, and which years the climatic conditions were ideal for winemaking. While he doesn't go so far as to describe the hints of leather with a blackberry finish you often see on California wine labels, he has an expert's palate. That day, he had brought not only champagne, but also some delicious Côte de Nuit, a prized Burgundy for the main course. I will not be able to reconstruct all the courses, but the pièce de résistance was roasted chevreuil. What is a chevreuil? I thought, not really wanting to know. The creature we were about to eat was presented on a tray, propped up on its front legs, as though in cobra pose. Everyone clapped as the platter was carried in from the kitchen. I thought. The word began like cheval, horse, but the dish looked too small to be that. How do I finesse this? I don't want to be the squeamish American. Chevreuil turned out to be deer or venison. I thought back to the time a hunter friend brought some venison to my family long ago, and we found it perfectly palatable. Venison is considered a delicacy in France, and we Americans were apparently the only ones to find those front legs in the least troubling. Jean-François carved the chevreuil and with plates passed to him served everyone as we gave our preferences. Un tout petit peu, s'il te plaît. Just a little, please, for my part. I've forgotten to mention that during this time the bright green partridge, the neighbor's pet, was flying all around the room, much to the delight of the children, who tried to get it to perch on their fingers or land on the table next to them. As you can imagine, though, there was virtually no space on the table. The French keep their pieces of baguette next to their plates as they eat, and the partridge had figured this out quite easily, landing and pecking crumbs from time to time in the little space that was left. Meanwhile, our daughters were trying to remember all the verses to A Partridge in a Pear Tree and the 7 children present had all joined in singing the verses in both French and English. The song turned out not to be easily.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?